Hello, everyone. My name is Preston Dennett, and welcome to a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. I call this one Extraordinary Humanoids 10 True Encounters. What else can I say about humanoids that I haven't already said? I find these encounters particularly fascinating. I think the answers to many of the questions of ET contact can be found in cases like these. These are very close encounters with little chance of misperception, and it's far beyond a simple sighting. The cases I want to present today do come from all over the world, including Canada, the United States, Venezuela, Brazil, Sweden, Germany, England, New Zealand, and Japan. So quite a worldwide series of events here. These cases span 5 decades from the 1950s all the way up to the 1990s and involve a wide variety of humanoids, what we would think of probably as grays, but short little hairy dwarves, certainly human-looking ETs, many different types of ETs, and of course the kinds of evidence we often see. And by that I mean landing traces, physiological effects, electromagnetic disturbances, animal reactions, these sort of things. So there's definitely quite a bit of evidence to support these cases. A few are single witness cases, some are multiple witness cases, and many of them do have outside supporting witnesses as well, and were professionally investigated. So I think these are very important cases. Some you may have heard of before, some I'm sure you haven't. And even those you have heard before, I think I've got some new details that you'll find quite interesting. So it's a lot of cases, let's just get started. And the first case I'd like to talk about, I call Smacked by an Alien. This occurred on July 2nd, 1953 in Spain, more specifically in Villares del Saz, Spain. And while this is a single witness case, it does have physical evidence to support it in the form of landing traces. Also, there are some outside supporting witnesses who saw strange activity at the time of this encounter. And what I like about this particular encounter is that it's a very early encounter, and the ET behavior is very unusual. This very unusual humanoid encounter was investigated and reported on by Professor Manuel Pedrajo. He was the original researcher and wrote about it in his book Flying Saucers and the Evidence, though it was later reprinted in other books and magazines. And in fact, Spanish researcher Antonio Ribera writes, and I quote, "Everything in the story points to it being genuine." Gordon Creighton was the editor of the Flying Saucer Review, where this story was published, and he writes, "I most emphatically agree with Antonio Ribera. I think this case bears all the hallmarks of complete genuineness." So, the main witness is Maximo Munoz Hernaiz, and at age 14 it was his job to watch over the grazing cattle on his family's ranch in the small village of Villares del Saz. This is outside of Cuenca, Spain. And he had to make sure that they didn't eat the family's crops. So, he sat there watching them on the afternoon of July 12, 1953, and this is when he heard a faint whistling sound behind him. And he ignored it at first, but finally, turning around, he saw a large, shiny gray globe. He estimates it was about 4 to 5 feet in diameter, not super big, but by the time he looked at it, it was already sitting on the ground not too far away. Now, this witness has never heard of UFOs. He's never been to school, so he has no idea what he's looking at. And his first thought was that this must be a balloon which escaped from some fair or celebration nearby. But then he took a closer look, and as he says, "I realized it wasn't one of them. It glowed brightly." And it was just a short distance away, so he got up, hoping to capture it before it blew away. And he walked right up to it. And as he approached to within arm's distance, an opening appeared at the top of the sphere, and three, quote, little men jumped out. They were very short, about 2 to 3 feet tall, he estimates, stocky in build, with gray skin and sort of Asian-looking features. He says they wore, quote, very smart blue-colored suits, and on their heads they had flat hats with what looked like visors. He also noticed a weird sort of flat metallic contraption of some sort strapped to their arms. And they immediately walked up to him, surrounded him, one on each side and one in front of him. And the one in front of Maximo spoke to him in a foreign language, which he couldn't understand. And as Maximo says, when I didn't understand what he said to me, the one standing in front of me smacked my face. Then they walked off. They grabbed hold of the thing that was on the balloon and jumped, and in they went. It glowed very bright. It made the same sort of little noise as before when I first saw it, and it went off very fast, like a rocket. I was scared. I ran home with the cows. So Maximo says that the beings did look around at the scenery before entering the craft. He also noticed that the craft glowed more brightly as it was taking off and going away. So after arriving home, he immediately told his parents, and his father was disbelieving at first, but could see that his son was very much scared and even trembling. So he called the police, and he and a police officer returned to the spot and were amazed to find landing traces, 4 holes in the ground about 2 inches deep and 1 inch across, and they were situated in a perfect square about 14 inches apart. And they also found several small footprints. Now, later it was discovered that a police officer by the name of Crescencio Atienza Martinez was in the nearby village of Honrubia, and he reports seeing a gray-white sphere in the sky around the same time as Maximo's encounter. And as he says, when the affair at Villares del Saz occurred, we saw what appeared to be a grayish-white object, which was stationary in the air and then vanished shortly afterwards. Its shape was very much like a ball. It left no trail, and when it disappeared, it went towards the east, having come more or less from the direction of Villares del Saz, which is of course where Maximo had his encounter. And after sharing his encounter once, Maximo refused to ever talk about it again. So we don't know if there's any follow-up to this story. There you go, a thoroughly investigated case of a humanoid encounter by a witness who's clearly never even heard of UFOs or extraterrestrials. And there's evidence to support it, physical evidence. It's a truly unusual case. I don't think I've heard of anything quite like that. And let's move on to the next case because there are so many. I suspect the vast majority of cases not only go unreported, but perhaps unseen. People aren't around to even see these ETs when they come and land on our planet and do whatever it is they do. But in this case, certainly they were seen. And I call this case a hair-raising experience. This encounter went almost, very nearly unreported. But thankfully the witness did decide to report it after he found other witnesses who apparently saw the same thing. This occurred in June of 1954 in Bengo. This is in Saskatchewan, Canada. And I have a sneaking suspicion that this one might actually be a reverse-engineered human-piloted craft, though I can't say for sure because I don't know what a human-piloted test craft would be doing at such low level and being witnessed by this farmer. So you can make up your own minds about that. This case was investigated by Canadian researcher Dean F. Clausen and again occurred in the small town of Bengo. The primary witness is anonymous. He's a married, middle-aged farmer known only by his initials, RF. And it was a clear, calm morning around 10 a.m. one day in June of 1954, and Mr. RF was out in the middle of his yard pumping water when he heard what sounded like the motor of a Honda motorbike approaching his farm. At this point, he couldn't see anything, but whatever it was getting closer. And as he says, there was no mistaking the motor sound. He says it didn't sound like a jet or a helicopter because, as he says, quote, it was reasonably silent. But it was something, so he looked up and got an incredible shock. And as DF says in his own words, all of a sudden, this object came right over between the house and the shed there. It was about 20 feet up. It looked to be made of something transparent, with two men sitting in it, with their helmet and goggles on. There was a kind of stick shift in the middle, like in today's cars. It made the hair stick up on the back of my neck. I couldn't believe it. So this object was clearly not a helicopter, as there were no propellers, but according to the witness, RF, it did create a, quote, big whirlwind or vacuum as it passed over. And as the witness says, I think it was going about 80 miles an hour. It wasn't that terrific a speed at all. There was kind of an uplift to it, not a downdraft, you know, a suction upward or a creation of air swirling. But ultimately, it was the appearance of this machine that shocked him the most. It was a perfectly round saucer-shaped craft, and it had a 12-foot wide transparent cockpit in the front with two human-looking men sitting side by side inside it. And the object itself wasn't much more than 14 feet wide. And according to DF, it was about the size of, quote, a good size room in a house. And as DF says in his own words, in thickness, the object looked like the lid of an old washing machine with this windshield on the front, something like a speedboat that you see in pictures with a one-piece windshield. The two objects, or men I presume they were, you could see their helmet and goggles quite distinctive. They were a darker color than the rest, which was just like transparent. I would say their clothing, there was no color to it. Now at the time, the farmer did not believe in UFOs, and he immediately assumed that this object had to be some sort of secret military craft. And as he says, I still think, any way you want to look at it, it's human beings. They're not from outer space as far as I'm concerned. There's no such thing as outer space men controlling these objects. I figure this is a well-protected experiment. I wouldn't say in Canada. I wouldn't say even in the United States. But it could be in Mexico. As far as small people manning these things, I would say there's lots of small people in Australia and some countries that could be trained to man these ships. In no way will I connect them with outer space. So as you can see, he's quite skeptical of the subject in general, yet he was stuck with what he saw. And as he says, he figured that this object was what people called, quote, these flying objects. And fearing ridicule and disbelief, he decided to keep quiet. And he did, for about 14 years, until he heard two other witnesses describing exactly what he saw. And as Mr. D.F. says, I never did tell anybody that I saw it for years because I figured, well, people would figure that's another crackpot. But this has to be one of them things you don't forget. Thankfully, this encounter had no lasting effects other than mentally, but DF doesn't appear to be particularly happy to have seen it. As he says, about all it's done for me was give me a hair-raising experience. So perhaps this one did involve a human-piloted reverse-engineered craft. But if so, it's a very early case and also quite strange, as why would they test a secret military craft at such low levels right over a person's farm? As usual, there are more questions than answers, but such is the nature of the UFO phenomenon. Definitely a very unusual case. Whether it's human-looking ETs or humans, hard to say for sure, but certainly worth knowing about. If it is reverse engineered way back in 1954, that's pretty early for that. Who knows? And let's move on to the next case, which you may have heard of before. It did get a lot of publicity. I call this one Why not to fight an ET? This occurred on November 28, 1954 in Petare, Venezuela. This involves two witnesses. Initially, there were in fact quite a number of other outside supporting witnesses, some undeniable physiological effects. And what I like about this case is I think it's a cautionary tale and provides some profound insights on what not to do if you have an ET encounter. The main witnesses in this case are two men, 25-year-old Gustavo Gonzalez and his co-worker Jose Ponce. The two of them were driving a truck in Petare to pick up a load of food goods. This time it was around 2 a.m. as they drove their delivery van along Bella Vista Street on the outskirts of Petare, and this is when they came upon a glowing, 6 foot wide, they estimate, metallic sphere. And this was hovering just a few feet over the road ahead of them, blocking their way. And as Gustavo says in his own words, when I passed by the Bella Vista Street in Petare driving a van, which belongs to me and accompanied by a collaborator, I was surprised and suddenly stopped the vehicle I was driving when I observed that the street where we were was illuminated as if it were noon in broad daylight. My collaborator, Jose Ponce, also astonished, opened the door of the van and descended to the ground. He came out running while seeing what I saw seconds later, having been able to observe an unknown living being which approached us. So this craft had two windows and what appeared to be a cupola on top, and there was this little being, which was described as hairy, very short, about 3 feet tall, with a round head, very large eyes, and had no clothes on except for a sort of loincloth, or what Gustavo said looked almost like a diaper. And instead of fingers, it appeared to have webbed claws. So Gustavo grabs his own flashlight and hurls it at the being. His flashlight missed, so he ran up to this figure, this apparent ET, and grabbed it, kind of in a bear hug, lifted it up, and tried to carry it back into his van. And he was surprised to find that this figure was quite light, but was even more surprised at how strong it was, because it immediately freed himself from Gustavo's grip and threw him 15 feet away down onto his back on the ground. Now Jose Ponce is watching all of this, and then he sees two other figures emerge from the bushes. They're carrying what looks like hunks of dirt or rocks in their hands, and seeing what's going on, these two other figures immediately jump into the craft, and one re-emerged, and it was holding a tube-like device in its hand. And seeing this figure point this device at Gustavo, Jose turned and ran to get help at the local police station, which was only a few blocks away. So meanwhile, this first figure that Gustavo had tried to grab jumped up 6 feet in the air, moving towards Gustavo. And this is when Gustavo pulled out a little knife that he carried. And as this being approached, Gustavo actually tried to stab this creature. And he made contact with the creature's body, but the knife bounced off the surface of the creature as if it was some sort of hard material. And at this time, the other being holding this sort of tube-like device shot a ray of light at Gustavo, temporarily blinding him. The ETs at this point immediately returned into their craft, which promptly took off. Now I just want to give a quote from Gustavo. Now mind you, this is translated from another language, so the wording is a bit awkward, but I think it's worth hearing Gustavo's experience in his own words. As he says, "At the beginning, I felt as if something prevented me from moving, but then I advanced towards where the unknown being stood. I took it between my arms and tried to stop it, but this small hombrecillo, small man, as we could qualify it, had much force and succeeded in breaking loose from the catch of my arms, which was applied to him, although he had been raised from the ground. It weighed something like 50 kilograms. and to have tried to carry him towards the van, I fell on the pavement at this reaction. It quickly stopped me. I tried to chase the hombrecillo, and when I looked at him again, I observed two more surprising things. Two more hombrecillos came towards me, of which one of them illuminated me with a lantern, coming apparently in assistance to his companion. The light prevented me from seeing what occurred during a while and a little time after. While being in my normal state, all had disappeared. When I left this state of, quote, trance, holding my Boy Scout knife in the right hand and realizing that the hombrecillo that was to be stopped was approaching me by instinct, because I held up the weapon which I carried and I struck with my weapon in the shoulder of the unknown being. But my surprise was without end when the knife slipped on its hard skin, not entering it at all. He appeared to have the skin of a rhino. The weapon skidded on the rough body of the unknown being and slipped as if it had hit a certain very solid material. I could notice that his hands were like four sharpened claws which tried to grab me. Meanwhile, my collaborator Jose Ponce came down by the small door on the right side of the van and moved towards the spherical ball when, arriving from the right slope of the First Avenue of Bella Vista, a hairy hombrecillo quickly climbed the slope of the hill with joined hands and carrying a lump of earth. So, at this point, after the beings shot this beam of light at Gustavo and returned to the craft and departed, Gustavo rushed to the police station, joining Jose Ponce, who was already there, and he reported what happened. Now, the police first thought they were drinking, did not believe them, but it quickly became very clear that the men were telling the truth. Both were visibly traumatized, and in fact, Gustavo had a long red scratch on the side of his body where he had grappled with this figure. Gustavo's employer, Antonio Scherchi, did vouch for Gustavo's character, and as he says, he has been on this job for more than a year. He handles about 1,000 items a day in money and always keeps his account in order. So at this point, the police did believe them. They took this account seriously. They went to the location and began to investigate. And of course, news of the encounter began to spread very quickly. And this is when many other people in the area revealed that they had seen apparently the same UFO in that area at that time. There were quite a lot of witnesses, in fact. Maria Antonietta Avellaneda lived nearby, and she said she was woken up around 1 or 2 a.m. by a loud explosive sound, followed by a weird whistling noise. 3 members of the Duderstad family were in their backyard in Petare that evening when they saw a disc-shaped object flashing different colors moving in the sky for several minutes. Another witness was Concepcion Garashan, and he said that around midnight she saw, with others, a silent glowing object moving across the sky again in Petare, and it was around 2 a.m. that they heard an explosive sound coming directly from Bella Vista Street, where the encounter happened. And there were other witnesses. The Cabaus family lived in downtown Petare, and they said that they saw a brilliant white, quote, like a very intense star, and they saw it around 2 a.m., the time of this encounter. Another gentleman, a doctor, Dr. Julio Garces, was driving his car very near Bella Vista Street around 2 a.m., and he says he heard a man cry out in terror. In fact, he stopped his car and looked around, but seeing nothing, continued on his way. Another witness was Manuel Maria Soria, and he said he was driving home around 2:30 a.m., not far away from Bella Vista Street, when he says a powerful light shone down on his car from above, accompanied by a loud whistling sound. So he raced home and told his mother, who confirmed that she also heard this strange sound. A lot of other witnesses, actually. Francisco Leal and several others who lived on nearby 7th Street said that they all saw intense lights, heard weird noises, and several of them called the police about it. And the police confirmed this. They said they received several calls about strange explosive sounds and unusual lights in the sky on that night. They actually sent out a patrol to look for it. And it turned out that one of the doctors who would treat Gustavo Gonzalez said that when he was returning home from a night call on that evening, he also saw a UFO. So this case did get a lot of attention. It was very well researched. And in fact, the witnesses were later interrogated by the Venezuelan government, who showed great interest in their case. A lot to like about that case. It being a multiple witness case with so many outside supporting witnesses, physiological evidence, and people who vouch for the sincerity of the witnesses. And the fact that the Venezuelan government showed a strong interest in this case, that's an indication that they absolutely found it credible. So certainly an interesting case that deserves to be well known. Here's a case you probably haven't heard before, but it's certainly an interesting case because it does have animal reactions. It has some really amazing physiological effects, electromagnetic disturbances as well, and just some very interesting behavior on the part of the ETs. It is a single witness case, but was investigated, so I think it's an important case. And I call this one the Mount Airy Alien. This encounter occurred in July of 1968 in Mount Airy, North Carolina. And it's quite a profound experience. The witness in this case is Miss Harold Eggers. We don't know her name. Miss Eggers' husband, Harold, was at work, and she was alone in their house on the Buck Shoals Road in Mount Airy. Now, interestingly, a little tidbit of trivia here. This town is allegedly the town which inspired the town of Mayberry in the Andy Griffith Show. So a nice little town. And it was around 2:30 a.m. when Miss Eggers was awakened by her dog frantically barking and scratching on the front door of her home, begging to be let inside. So she got out of bed and she immediately heard this penetrating sound, which she described as, quote, a huge swarm of bees. So she opened the front door, her dog ran inside, hid under the bed, and covered his ears with his paws. And Miss Eggers was about to close the front door when she saw something astonishing. A large circular flying saucer hovering only about 90 feet away from her home and only 50 feet off the ground. So this is close. She could immediately see that this craft had a dome on top with about 12 square windows around the circumference. And in fact, a red-orange light shone brightly from these windows. The craft wasn't super huge, about 15 feet wide, she estimates, 6 or 7 feet high. It was metallic. She said the base of the craft looked like aluminum, and she could see it glinting in the light of the full moon. So naturally she became a little bit frightened and immediately shut the front door. It was at this moment that the lights in the house dimmed. She quickly shut them all off and retreated in fear to the bedroom. And she looked out the bedroom window at the craft, and this was when she was amazed to see a sort of strange-looking short humanoid staring directly at her from one of the middle windows of the UFO. And she could see it close enough to see that it wore a tight-fitting silver uniform, some sort of silver helmet on its head, and she estimates it was no more than 3 or 4 feet tall. So after almost 5 minutes of staring at it, she noticed that her dog was still shaking in fear under her bed. So she quickly closed her bedroom curtains in hopes that this weird craft would just go away. However, even with the curtains closed, she could still hear the loud buzzing noise coming from this craft. So shortly later, she looked outside again and watched as this craft moved to the east, where it hovered across the street above some nearby treetops. She tried to just ignore this craft, just lie down in bed and go to sleep, but she couldn't, and she kept getting up and looking out through other windows of the house to watch this UFO. She says it remained pretty much in place, pulsating with this reddish orange light and making this very loud buzzing noise. She could see that this upper part of the craft was glowing with a yellowish light. And it stayed there for a long time. After about 20-25 minutes, the craft finally left. At this point, Mrs. Eggers and her dog still remained in the bedroom, and she says she was unable to sleep at all that night. When morning arrived, she did discover something strange. 3 electric clocks in her house had lost about an hour of time. She also learned that there had been a power failure in her immediate neighborhood that same evening. So that doesn't sound like a coincidence. Apparently the UFO affected the power in some way. Certainly looks like that. But when her husband Harold came home, she told him what happened, and it was clear to him that, quote, she had certainly seen something. And now, other than being, frightened, emotionally frightened by the encounter, the witness did suffer some fairly alarming symptoms, including insomnia, dimming of vision, and headaches, which persisted on and off for several days following the encounter. Why was the UFO there? It's hard to say, but this area does include a granite quarry and a hydroelectric station, which were not too far away, and both of which are known by UFO researchers to attract UFOs. So that could be a factor here. But this case was investigated by researcher Fawcett, a well-respected researcher, and it remained undisclosed for 5 years until finally the witness consented to allow her name to be used. And as Fawcett writes, I'm inclined to accept this story as a truthful account, especially in view of the witness's physiological effects, the severe animal reaction, the sounds described typically used to describe bona fide UFO appearances at low altitude, the shape of the UFO often reported elsewhere, the time the incident occurred, the large number of similar UFO occupant reports worldwide. A recent scientific computer study report of UFO occupants indicates 69% are 4 feet and under. That's very fascinating that most ETs that people describe are quite short. I wonder what we can take away from that. I don't know, but it's certainly interesting. And yeah, that case is pretty well supported with the animal reactions, the electromagnetic disturbances, and of course the physiological effects that followed after the encounter. Makes me wonder if this was more than just a sighting. There's no direct indication of that, but I wonder. And now let's move to the next case, which I call What True Beauty Is. And this case certainly got a lot of attention where it occurred in Brazil, but I think it's virtually unknown in the United States and elsewhere, which is one of the reasons I wanted to cover it, because it does have some very interesting interactions and extensive interactions with these ETs, human-looking ETs. I found this case particularly interesting because of the way the ETs were dressed. This also does involve an apparent healing, though that's not entirely clear. It occurred on October 2nd, 1968 in the city of Linz. It's actually more of a village, back then certainly, but it's near Sao Paulo, Brazil. And what an extraordinary case this one is. The primary witness in this case is Toribio Pereira, then a 41-year-old city worker who on the day of his encounter was outside operating a tractor to begin excavating a lot at Avenida da Saudade. This is on the outskirts of Linz. It was about 6:20 a.m., again on October 2nd, 1968, and Toribio was replenishing the fluids in the tractor engine when, only feet away from him, a beautiful, sort of golden-colored oval-shaped craft came in for a landing. At least he thought it was going to land on the ground, but instead this object seemed to hover about a foot above. It made no sound that he could hear, but he could see that this craft was about 15 feet long, 9 feet wide, and it had this sort of weird platform around the center and a transparent dome on top. And looking inside this transparent dome, he immediately saw 4 stools and a weird control panel, and he became very frightened, wanted to run away, but found that he was unable to move, and the next thing he knew, 4 human-looking men had appeared. Now, they did look, he says, identical to each other, like identical twins. There were 4 of them, and although they looked human, they were dressed quite strangely. Each one wore a blue robe with sort of a red skirt and brown sandals on their feet. He said they were 5.5 feet tall, very handsome, and had smooth skin and childlike expressions. And as Toribio says in his own words, they had clothing like a saint, down to the knees, and on their heads a hood. They wore sandals open at the front so that their toes were visible. The color of their sandals was dark brown, and they had narrow bands tied round their legs up as far as the knees, like the ancient Romans. So these 4 men immediately separated and began doing separate activities. One stayed on the rim of the craft, holding what Toribio believed to be some kind of weapon. It reminded him of an electric drill. The second one was right next to this first one, and he was scooping up soil with sort of a silver shovel, which reminded Toribio of a conch shell. Now the third figure walked right up to Toribio's tractor and appeared to be examining the engine, and the fourth stayed inside the craft in the dome and was operating this strange panel, which reminded Toribio of sort of a piano keyboard or a typewriter. And all the time he was doing this figure was staring fixedly at Toribio. So this all happened in a matter of moments, and almost immediately the man standing on the rim of the craft looked directly at Toribio and pointed the device he had in his hand at Toribio. At this point, it released a beam of light or a luminous orb, which hit Toribio in the stomach area. And this is when he felt this sort of severe pain. And he was absolutely paralyzed at this point, but could still hear and see everything. And as he watched, these beings returned into the craft. They sat on these 4 stools that were inside this dome. The platform that surrounded the craft retracted. This object made 3 very bright flashes, rose slowly upwards, and with a very soft sound, it darted off at very high speed, disappearing in a few seconds. As Toribio says, its flight was like that of a duck, very smooth and low at first, and then rapidly putting on great speed. So it took quite a few moments for Toribio to recover, and it was with great difficulty he got up and waved down a truck. It turned out to be his friend Ishmael, who took him directly to the hospital, because Toribio was pretty traumatized by this encounter. He said he felt quite weak, very tired. He actually went home afterwards and wept with emotion. And over the next few weeks, he says he lost about 28 pounds and suffered from this persistent tingling on his left side. Later, returning to the site, Toribio and his fellow employees did see strange marks on the ground and soil that looked like it had been moved or scooped out. So Brazilian Air Force authorities were very interested in his case and interrogated him for 3 full days. But it doesn't end here. It was 1 year and 9 months later, on July 19, 1971, at 2:30 p.m., that Toribio reports he was taking a nap in his home and he had this, quote, dream that these same ETs showed up. Now he feels this was more than a dream, because in fact he felt physical, mild electric shocks in his intestinal area. At the time he was suffering from some illness, and the being said that Toribio had been cured of the ill effects that had been caused by the ray they had shot at him, but that they were not responsible for his ill health, which they said was caused by germs. They told him that they could hear everything that was going on around him, and they then told him, when you, and Toribio took that to mean all humanity, when you have fully evolved, you will know what true beauty is. And then the ETs said that they would not contact him again in this way. So Toribio woke up feeling ill, and he had an echoing hum ringing in his head. And he was not sure if this was a dream or a physical experience, but I believe he's leaning towards this being a real experience. And interestingly, according to researcher Nigel Rhymes, he was actually in the Sao Paulo area on that day and saw a brilliant light, quote, shining like a yellow pearl in the sky. And this was just 1 hour after Toribio's dream. Nigel says that this object hung motionless for about 3 minutes, then moved slowly off and disappeared. Now finally, there's another afternote to this case. Some years later, the date is not listed, Toribio was driving under the Alcantara Machado Viaduct on Avenida Radial Leste when he saw this same object again, very low, at the level of the underpass itself. And he heard a telepathic voice speak in his head which said, "Don't be scared, because only you are seeing us. We want to talk to you." And they did. The ETs told Toribio that they were not humans, but came from a world within our own. They explained a little bit about their culture and world, but Toribio says he really didn't understand exactly what they were saying, but he believed that they were trying to tell him that they came from another dimension. The ETs told him that they were androgynous in nature, that they were on an evolutionary level above ours. They told him that they reproduce medically by taking fluid from the body and using incubators to raise their young. They said that because Toribio was so weak, they wanted to do an experiment on him. And that's the last thing he knows. The next thing he knew, they stopped communicating and the craft was gone. That, he says, was his final encounter. He's unsure whether they did anything physically to him at that time, but that is where the case ends. That case is truly interesting because it is very well verified. And what's also interesting to me is that it wasn't just a one-off. This involved multiple encounters. I suspect that's more often the case, really the rule rather than the exception. Hard to say for sure because there are many cases that are one-offs. But absolutely a fascinating case. And so is this next one, which is quite brief, and I'm pretty darn sure you haven't heard of this one. There's not a whole lot to it really, but I found it interesting. And I call this one 3 Aliens on Hudson Beach. This occurred in May of 1971 in Waluku. This is in Auckland, New Zealand, and a very brief single witness case which wasn't apparently officially investigated, but certainly unusual. This case was published by a local newspaper but apparently never officially investigated, and the witness is an anonymous elderly woman who lived along Hudson's Beach, and she wrote to the newspaper about her experience, and I'll just quote her directly. As she says in her own words, "I live alone, and a few weeks ago," meaning May 1971, "a few weeks ago I was up having a cup of tea between 2 a.m. and 3:30 a.m. The tide comes to my gate, and this morning it was in, but not right up. I drew my curtain a little to peep out, and I saw what I took to be 3 men chatting on the sand. I thought it must be some chaps cleaning fish. Then I said to myself, not at 3 a.m. Outside the gate is an old macrocarpa and a pine tree. And through the big branch of the pine shone a very bright red light which hovered slightly. The figures seemed to be shrouded in a gray mist. A little later, a silver strip appeared in the water and appeared to light the way back for the men to get on the red ball. As I watched, the silver strip disappeared and the red ball moved off, slowly at first, and it seemed to bounce along in the air. It was quite low. Then it gathered height before nearing the aerodrome area, at which time it soared very high. So that's all we know about this case, but as the editor of the newspaper who published this letter wrote, all very strange, but the story has the ring of authenticity. And I agree. But again, unfortunately, there is no further information on this case. I like that case just because the witness seems so obviously sincere. It's a very unusual, although brief case, which makes me wonder just how many cases are out there. How many go unreported? And again, how many go completely unobserved? Because it was pure luck that the witness was actually up at that late hour to drink a cup of tea and saw what she did. A really interesting case. And now we move to the next one, which I call Something Wasn't Quite Right. That is, of course, a direct quote from one of the witnesses. I like this case because it's quite extensive, and by that I mean it lasted a long time. This UFO and the humanoids came quite close to the witnesses. There were multiple witnesses. There's a lot of interesting things about this case. I also like the fact that the witnesses made sketches of what they saw. This case occurred on May 3rd, 1973 in Mantorp, Sweden. And while this case has been widely reported, I was able to find the original article in the Swedish language and found some details that I don't think have been reported at all. So if you've heard of this case, I think I've got some more information for you about it. It was 9:45 p.m. as Sigrid Carlson left her home to walk her dog near her home in Mantorp, Sweden. She says it was a clear, beautiful, starry night, and as her dog ran off to relieve itself, Sigrid saw a, quote, red light approach from the northeast. She thought it was a plane at first, so she didn't pay much attention to it and just returned back to her home with the dog. But back inside, she went to the room that faced the front yard, and the room was in total darkness, so she could now see that this object was still out there, this glowing red light. And as she says, the light ball was going too slow to be an airplane, and it stopped several times. I realized that something wasn't quite right, and therefore awakened my 11-year-old son Robert to have as a witness. So Robert came over to the window, and he and his mother watched as this glowing red sphere stopped about a half-mile away and hovered over a house that was very well lit with floodlights. And this object remained there for quite a long time, pulsating. Then suddenly it started to move away from the house with a rocking forward movement. And as Sigrid says, as the ball of light started to move, we heard a jet-like sound that turned into a hissing sound, like a steam engine letting the steam out. The sound didn't just come from the ball of light itself, but seemed to fill up the whole environment. But it wasn't so loud that we couldn't make ourselves heard when we talked about what it could be that we saw. And after about 5 or 10 minutes, the ball of light turned, and this is when it came right towards their house. And as Sigrid says, as the object approached, we could see that it was silver in color and that it changed from the previously strong red color to yellow-white. And now they could both see that this was actually an oval-shaped craft with a transparent midsection, very much your classic saucer. Now Sigrid was a little bit nearsighted, but she could see that there were two blurry humanoid shapes in the middle. Her 11-year-old son Robert could see much more clearly, and he was watching, of course, as this object moved over a fir tree about 150 feet away, maybe 180 feet high, And this is when he shouted out, "Mother, it's people watching us." So Robert later told investigators that this craft looked much like two saucers placed against each other, rim to rim. And as Robert says in his own words, "In the middle of the craft, I saw the silhouettes of two people bending over and tilting down at us." The craft then continued moving, passed by the house moving slightly faster than a car. Sigrid and Robert ran to another room and looked out the window to continue watching it. And as Sigrid says, "From there we could see the craft again." And as they watched, this craft went over a field, moving in a swaying motion and hovering. It started going slowly back and forth as if looking for a place to land. But then, without warning, it made a U-turn and disappeared towards the east. Now here is a map which shows the path of the object. Point A is where the object appeared. Point B is where the object's closest approach and where the humanoids could be clearly seen. Point C is where the object moved back and forth, seeming to get ready to land. And point D is the direction that the object departed. Now, when Sigrid's husband, a night watchman, came home the next morning, he listened in astonishment as Sigrid explained the encounter. And he had Sigrid sketch the craft, and then he heard the story from his son and had his son separately sketch the craft. And when he saw the similarity between their two drawings, he no longer had any doubts about what they had seen. And later Sigrid called the police and asked them if they had any idea what she had seen. But they didn't. Robert, the son, came away absolutely convinced that they had seen an actual flying saucer and the occupants inside. Sigrid is a little more reserved. She says she doesn't know what it was, but, as she says, it was neither a helicopter nor an airplane. I began to be afraid when the object had disappeared. It was an incredibly powerful experience. I think I was a little shocked by what I saw. I think you'll agree that's a very compelling case with two witnesses who were both clearly profoundly affected by what they saw. I really do wonder what those ETs are up to, why they hung around for so long. Hard to say. But now we move to the next case, which you may have heard of because it did get a lot of publicity, but I absolutely found some information which I am very confident other people who know about this case haven't heard of before. I call this one Touched by an Alien, because in fact the witness was touched by the actual extraterrestrial. It's a multiple witness encounter, a lot of supporting witnesses, some absolutely conclusive physical evidence in the form of landing traces. I think that is one of the most compelling things about this case. It's why I wanted to report it, but it's also extremely unusual. It occurred on February 23rd, 1975 in Kofu, Japan. It's another reason I wanted to report on this case because we don't hear a lot of cases coming from Japan. But they're there. This may in fact be one of Japan's most famous humanoid encounters. It was 6:30 p.m. as two 7-year-old boys, their names are Masato Kono and Katsuhiro Yamahata. They were roller skating in a paved area not far from Masato's home in Kofu, Japan. And looking up, it was Katsuhiro who first noticed a strange light in the sky, and he pointed it out to his friend Masato. The two of them watched as this light moved closer, and now they could see that this was actually two lights, both orange in color. One was slightly larger, and apparently they were separate objects, because the larger one moved off to the east, while the smaller one continued to move closer in this weird, irregular motion. And as it got very close to them, they could now hear a strange sound coming from it. And both felt it was coming for them, so they ran and hid, and watched this light fly around the area and then move off. At this point they thought the sighting was over, but things were about to get much more exciting. because it turned out that the light hadn't moved off at all, and in fact, it had landed in a vineyard just a short distance away. Now, seeing a light there in the vineyard, the two boys first thought it might be a fire, but as they approached for a closer look, they saw that it was in fact a dome-shaped saucer, 15 feet wide and 6 feet high, with what looked like 3 hemispherical landing pods on the bottom. The whole craft was glowing orange, but as they walked up close to it, they saw that it in fact was silvery and metallic. Masato was surprised to see 5 what looked like symbols on the craft that looked kind of oriental but made no sense. Katsuhiro saw them as well, but Katsuhiro approached and began walking around the craft itself, and when he reached the opposite side, he heard movement coming from inside the craft, and suddenly an opening appeared, and a ladder extended down to the ground from the opening. Immediately, a 4-foot-tall humanoid exited the craft via the ladder. This humanoid wore a shiny silver jumpsuit and was carrying what the boy said looked kind of like a rifle slung over its shoulder. This humanoid had dark brown skin and large pointed ears, and where the face would be, there was a wavy sort of wrinkled surface which extended down to the mouth, ending in what looked like 3 sort of triangular fang-like protrusions, each about 6 inches long. You can see from their drawings what this humanoid looked like, so this might be a helmet, though the children did not specifically say this. They did say that the head was abnormally large for the size of the body and had no hair. Now, the boys not only saw the humanoid, but they could look through the open doorway and into the interior of the craft. And inside this craft, they saw a second identical looking, though slightly smaller humanoid, who was seated on a chair with its hand on a lever of some kind and a screen in front of him. They said the interior of the craft was filled with all kinds of strange, what looked like control panels. So at this point, the boys became quite frightened and were about to run away when something truly extraordinary happened. The being that was outside the craft approached Katsuro and patted him twice on the shoulder, actually reached out and touched him. And this is when he saw that it had 4 fingers. The being then spoke some unintelligible words that sounded to him like a tape recorder being rewound or something like that. And this freaked him out. Poor Katsuhiro sat down on the ground, paralyzed in fear. The being kind of walked around the boy as if inspecting him, and Katsuhiro, being unable to move, decided to just play dead. Now at this point, Masato is freaking out and he shouted, "Let's get out of here." But unable to move, Katsuhiro said, "I can't." So, at this point, the boys were absolutely in a panic. Masato rushed forward, picked up his friend Katsuhiro, and literally carried him piggyback style away from the site of this landing. At one point, they did turn around, and they could see that this figure was starting to follow them. And again, they could see inside the craft through the open door, and they noticed that you could look all the way across from the inside to the other side of the craft and out the window. And this was weird because from the outside of the craft looking in, the window was opaque. But from the inside of the craft looking out, they could see the landscape and the environment around them. So thoroughly freaked out and afraid, they ran back to Masato's home, which was only about 300 feet away. And Katsuhiro excitedly explained that there was a landed UFO in the vineyard, and he was told to just stop talking nonsense, sit down, and eat dinner. But when Masato insisted that this was all true, and their mothers both saw how upset and frightened their children were, the mothers decided to go outside, and they were amazed to see a bright glowing light in the center of the vineyard. And they were quite close to it. They walked up and approached it to a distance of about 150 feet. and we're trying to figure out what this might be. Could it be a reflection or what? As one of the mothers says, it was a brilliant orange color. It was like watching fireworks or something. It was really glowing brightly. It was spinning and glowing brightly and blinking. Now at this point, Katsuhiro's mother wanted to get a closer look, but the boys begged her not to, screaming that there were aliens there who might take them away. And it was at this point the light began to pulsate rapidly, increasing in brightness for about 5 minutes. So at this point the mothers called out to their husbands to view this sight, but at this point this light became dim, decreased in size, ascended slightly, and disappeared. So the husbands didn't really get a good view at it. Now, venturing to the area shortly afterwards, they at first found no evidence of this craft. Masato himself was unable to sleep that night, and he cried through most of the evening. And as far as Katsuhiro, the next morning, he was too frightened to leave the house alone to walk to school and insisted that his mother accompany him. But they did go to school, and when they got there they were shocked and amazed to see a drawing of the craft that they had seen on the chalkboard. It turned out that another boy, a local boy, 8-year-old Ichiro Minagishi, was driving with his parents through Kofu about a half hour before the boy's sighting, and he saw a shiny object flying towards the area where the boys had seen the craft land. So all of them began talking excitedly, and very quickly their teachers took notice and realized something very strange was going on. They ended up calling some journalists, and they all went together to the location to investigate. And this is when they found some amazing evidence. A close examination of the spot where this craft had landed showed a ring pattern on the ground, and in fact one of the cement fence posts there had been knocked over exactly where the craft had landed, and 2 other fence posts were also damaged. Also, there was some steel netting that was attached to the posts that was bent as if a heavy object had bent it. There were also numerous unexplained holes on the ground and what looked like white ash. So researchers took notice of this, soil samples were collected and tested, and they showed high levels of radiation. This was really surprising, so more tests were ordered, and these additional tests yielded the same results. And it wasn't long after this that more witnesses were discovered. A man who lived nearby said he was drawn outside on that night by his barking dog, and he saw a yellow object move swiftly across the sky and descend behind some buildings. So he apparently saw this object arriving. Also, there was another man, a priest, who lived nearby, and he said that on that very night he saw a yellow object zigzagging across the sky and disappear. And there was another young girl who was on her balcony, again in this same area, and she described this strange yellow light in the sky. So, years passed, the boys never wavered from their story. They later granted further interviews as teenagers, and there was still a lot of interest in their story. And in fact, at age 30, they consented to undergo hypnosis, and they relived the event. Though as far as I know, no further details emerged. But about 8 years after the boys' encounter, yet another witness surfaced. And this was amazing because this lady by the name of Midori was driving in the area, apparently by this location on that night, when she heard what she described as a loud banging noise. And she says she saw 2 strange humanoids standing in the road. And I'll just quote Midori directly because she granted a television interview. And as she says, there in the crossroads stood 2 boys. They looked to be junior high school boys, about 130-40 centimeters, 4 feet tall. Their faces were completely black. When looking from far away, Thinking it strange, I beeped my car horn, but they didn't move. I approached them and beeped again, but they still didn't move. I thought it was strange, but I was in a rush, so I continued to drive. When I came up beside them, I saw that they were very dark, and then one put their hand on my windscreen. I could see its palm. It was completely black, and had wrinkles going across it, all down the palm. It didn't have the usual lines we humans have. And I saw its face. The bottom of its eyes were completely straight, and its eyelids were very wrinkly. I was shocked. I only looked at it for around 5 or 6 seconds. I only saw its hand and face. I was too surprised to see anything else. But there are some amazing similarities to what she and the boys saw. Perhaps she saw them without their helmets, because the boys did not describe eyes. Hard to say for sure, but this seems to be more than just a coincidence. There was a lot of interest in what the boys described as seeing symbols on the sides of the craft, and people tried to translate them, not with a whole lot of success. But whatever the writing meant, this case became one of Japan's most studied multi-witness UFO humanoid sightings on record. I mean, come on, how can you deny that case? With two direct witnesses who saw the humanoids and the landed UFO touched the ET, their parents saw the UFO, people all over the area saw the UFO, another person saw humanoids. The witnesses have never backed down from their case. And of course, the extraordinary landing trace evidence with the cement poles being knocked down, the marks on the ground, the abnormal radiation readings, and so forth. It's an undeniable case of ET contact. And here is another one, which is perhaps not as well authenticated, but certainly was researched. And I'm sure you haven't heard of this one either, because it's quite an obscure case. I call this one Come With Us on a Journey. This one occurred on January 27, 1983 in Bloxwick, England. And this case is super interesting because of the interaction that this gentleman had with the ETs and what they tried to get him to do, which he was reluctant to do. The main witness in this case is known only as Alan. He's a 29-year-old married factory worker, and he reports having had many paranormal experiences in his life, mostly ghostly encounters. But he says he always had a feeling that one day he might meet extraterrestrials, which, ironically, he was skeptical of. But it was around 9:10 p.m., again on January 27, 1983, that it happened, a face-to-face encounter with humanoids. It was a cold, clear night as Alan hiked on this path that bordered the Essington Canal, which you can see here, bordering or running parallel to the M6 highway in Bloxwick, England. He was on his way to go visit a friend, and it was a 2-mile long walk, but he was quite fit, so this wasn't a problem. Now, this canal is immediately adjacent to two nature reserves, the Piggeries Local Nature Reserve and the Oily Guffs Nature Reserve. And at that time, it was a pretty remote and natural area. So as Alan walked, his attention was suddenly drawn upward to a strange craft that hovered at low level, almost directly above him. He said it was roughly saucer-shaped. It had a silver mirror-like finish and a bright band around the center. He said it was surrounded by this strange haze, and he only saw it for about 5 seconds when it winked out. But it was long enough for him to determine that it definitely wasn't a plane. He was puzzled by it, but as it had disappeared so quickly, he just kept walking. But it was only moments later, and he just walked a few yards ahead, when he saw two humanoid figures standing to the right of his path, looking right at him. And he was struck immediately, amazed by their appearance. Both were male. He estimates about 5.5 feet tall. They looked human. They had dark, curly hair, high cheekbones, and kind of looked Asian in appearance, but were very light complected and had blue eyes. Both were absolutely identical in appearance, with perfectly proportioned muscular bodies. They both wore tight-fitting, light gray jumpsuits with a strange insignia on their left chest. And even though it was a dark night, he could see them clearly because they were both surrounded by a strange glowing aura. So at this point, he's not really afraid, he's more intrigued by their strange appearance. And he walked right up to them. And this is when they began to speak in unison together in an almost mechanical robot-like voice in English, but with this absolute perfect diction. And they told him, "Come with us on a journey." And Alan said that even though they spoke, their mouths remained open and their lips were not moving. So this freaked him out, and he declined their invitation and explained to them, "I don't want to leave my wife." And they replied, "You will see her again." Alan told them no, that he still did not want to go. And they told him, "You will be rewarded." Still, Alan declined. And by this point, he was becoming afraid by their insistence and that they might take him forcibly. But to his surprise and relief, they didn't. They just departed. But they left in this very unusual way. He says they kind of turned and, quote, glided away with their feet off the ground like ice skaters. He also noticed that the tall grass all around them had no effect on their speed. So Alan was absolutely stunned and baffled by this encounter. It was clear to him at this point that these were not normal people, these were ETs, but why, he wondered, did they want him? He admitted that he was not really an educated man. And he also wondered what they were doing there in such a lonely, remote area. Uh, how could they possibly have known he would be there? None of it made any sense to him. So afterwards he told his friends, but they did not believe him. He told his wife, but she thought that he was, quote, mad. The encounter did have a profound effect on him. He began having vivid nightmares, he says nightmares, about strange robed beings and other colorful exotic planets. And these were serious enough that he actually went to a doctor to seek treatment and got a prescription for sleeping pills. He says his appetite suffered and he lost about 14 pounds following this encounter. He did return to the site, hoping to find an alternative explanation for what happened, but of course there was none. And frustrated by the response from those around him, he did try calling UFO organizations, but found little support there either. So he began reading UFO books, hoping to find some answers, and finally heard about Jenny Randles, a very prominent English researcher, and contacted her, and she did take his report seriously. In fact, his case was later published in the Northern UFO News. It was, according to Jenny Randles, the first humanoid case in Britain in over 2 years. But as reported in local newspapers, both before and after Allen's encounter, there were in fact several other impressive sightings in this same area. So apparently it was not an isolated event. Now I can't blame Allen, the main witness, for not wanting to go with the ETs. That must have been quite a surprise and certainly a big decision. I'm not sure how I would have reacted. I'd like to think I would say yes, take me on a journey. I think that would be one of the most fascinating experiences a person could have, but he declined for whatever reason, and I can't blame him. It must have been a real surprise to see these guys approach him like this. What a case. And here's the last one in this little collection. I call this one, "Nothing Bad Will Happen to You." And that's a direct quote from the ET. I'm not sure if the witness will agree with that. We don't have a whole lot of information about this case, but it's certainly an interesting case which occurred on February 18, 1990 in Korbach, Germany. And I like this case because there are physiological reactions with the witness as well as animal reactions. And it's just a very interesting ET human interaction. This next and final case comes from pioneering German researchers Ulrich Magin and Ilbrand van Ludwiger. The witness is anonymous, and it was around 7:30 p.m. on the evening of February 18, 1990, as the witness was walking her dog in the Waldeck Hills. This is near Korbach in Germany. And suddenly, for no reason that the witness could see, her dog lay down on its back, began to whimper, and wouldn't move, wouldn't take another step. She was unable to get her dog to respond, so she physically picked her dog up and began to carry him. And it was just shortly later, around this time, she heard a low hum. And this weird humming sound continued for about 30 seconds and then stopped. And this is when she noticed a large craft, about 30 feet wide and 5 feet high, floating above a clearing. And as soon as she saw it, it was glowing incredibly brightly for about 30 seconds, but then became dim. And she could now see that this was a metallic craft. The bottom half, she said, glowed red like a fiery coal. The craft was very low to the ground and appeared to be resting on 4 landing legs. At this point, the witness's dog escaped, jumped from her arms, and ran off. And the witness at this point had been so dazzled by this bright light from the craft that she was having trouble seeing in the dark. And she wanted to run away. She was about to run away when she says she was struck by a, quote, blue ray of light, and this rendered her unable to move. She says this light beam remained focused on her, and she started to feel this weird shortness of breath, and she began to perspire quite heavily. So she was unable to call out for help. Then suddenly, as the witness says, quote, there was a voice. She said it sounded metallic and yet female, and it spoke to her saying, don't be afraid. Nothing bad will happen to you. But this provoked even more fear in the witness, who now, she says, was in a state of panic. And this is when the blue ray of light kind of changed to a green color, and she now felt an improvement in her ability to breathe. And this is when she noticed that there were 2 strange humanoids standing in front of her. They were both very short, just over 4 feet in height, but they did have normal-looking facial features. She said their skin was quite gray in color. Their heads were totally bald. Both wore dark green overalls, and the overalls had a strange symbol that she doesn't quite remember what it looked like on the chest. They apparently spoke to her, but she was not able to understand what they said. Shortly later, they returned to their craft. At this point, the green beam, which had been on her the whole time, vanished, and the witness says she fell unconscious to the ground, and when she woke up, it was already 9:30. About 3 hours had passed. Her dog was nowhere to be seen. She began to stumble home. She took a few steps and actually vomited. She continued home, vomiting once more. When she arrived home, she found her dog still waiting for her. So this case was researched, but the researchers provide no further information on the incident. I do wish we had more information on that case. I suspect it might have been more than just a simple sighting, but without further information, any such conclusions are impossible to make. But I'd be surprised if that was a one-off, given that this witness had such a close encounter with these ETs, given that she fell unconscious. I mean, she may have been taken on board. I don't know. That's one of the problems with this field is due to the cover-up, due to the ridicule and disbelief. It's very difficult to get a full investigation. Thankfully, things are changing. So that is the show for today. 10 really extraordinary cases coming from all over the world, multiple witnesses supported by a wide variety of compelling physical evidence. I think it's absolutely insane that people are still skeptics. I mean, how many cases do we need to convince people that this is actually happening? It is. And it's been going on for a very long time. And given that pretty much without exception, people are seeing humanoids, that's also a very important takeaway. And like many contactees have been told, we share a common heritage. And I think these humanoid cases speak to that. But certainly some very interesting interactions by a wide variety of ETs. So thank you once again. I hope you've enjoyed this episode, perhaps even learned a little bit. I truly appreciate you watching. And until next time, keep searching for answers, keep looking for the truth, and most important of all, and I mean it, keep having fun. Bye for now.